What would you do if you waited months for a wife, only to see a child step off that train? A child you didn't ask for. A child with a secret that could destroy you. Would you turn her away? Or would you discover that sometimes what you get is not what you wanted? It's what you were chosen for. The sun over Willow Creek, Montana, was a hammer in the sky. It was the summer of 1887, and the heat was a physical thing, a weight on your shoulders that promised to break you. Dust wasn't just on the ground. It was the air you breathed, the taste in your mouth, the grit in your teeth. Ezekiel Thompson stood on the warped planks of the train platform, his shadow a short, sharp stain on the wood. He was 34 years old, but the land had aged him. Hard lines were carved around his eyes, a map of worry and loss. 3 years. It had been 3 long years since the blizzard that took everything. It took his cattle, it took his savings, and it took his wife, Priscilla, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her laughter in a silent house. He was a ghost on his own ranch, a sprawling property that was slowly being swallowed by the wild. A man can't run a ranch alone. He can't mend fences, tend what little stock he has left, and also cook, clean, and keep the loneliness from eating him alive. So he'd done something desperate. He'd sent for a mail-order bride. The telegram in his hand was soft as cloth, worn from 100 readings. Arriving Tuesday, Ems Whitmore. Today was Tuesday. He heard the whistle first, a mournful cry that sliced through the shimmering heat. A black smudge on the horizon grew, chugging, breathing smoke and steam. The iron horse. His heart kicked against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The woman who would help him rebuild. The woman who might, just might, make his house a home again. The train screamed to a halt, a monster sighing steam. The conductor, a man named Pike, with a belly that strained the buttons of his vest, swung down. Passengers began to emerge. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, fanning herself furiously. A slick-haired salesman with 2 large cases, a family with 3 loud children, but no one who looked like Millicent Whitmore. Ezekiel's throat went dry. Did she change her mind? Was this all a fool's errand? The hope that had been a fragile flame in his chest began to flicker and die. Then the conductor turned back to the passenger car. He reached a hand up, his movements gentle. Ezekiel craned his neck, squinting. This had to be her. But it wasn't a woman who took the conductor's hand. It was a girl, a little wisp of a thing, no more than 10 years old. Her hair was the color of wild honey, tied back in a neat braid. Her dress was a faded blue, clean but patched at the elbows. She clutched a carpet bag that seemed too big for her, her knuckles white. Her eyes, wide and brown, darted around the platform like a frightened deer. Ezekiel blinked. The heat was playing tricks on him. It had to be. But she was still there, alone. The other passengers were gone, melting back into the dusty town. She saw him looking. She straightened her small shoulders, took a breath, and walked directly toward him. The sound of her small boots on the wooden platform was the only sound in the world. She stopped right in front of him and looked up, her gaze steady and unnervingly direct. "Are you Mr. Ezekiel Thompson?" she asked, her voice as clear as a bell. Ezekiel couldn't speak. He just nodded, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. "I'm Magnolia Whitmore," she said, and then she did something that shattered his world. She stuck out a tiny gloved hand. "But you can call me Maggie. I believe you were expecting me." The platform seemed to tilt under his feet. He stared at the small hand, then back at her face. There must be a mistake," he stammered. I arranged for a wife." "Yes, sir. I know," she said, her expression not changing. She was calm. Too calm. "My Aunt Millicent was supposed to come. She wrote you the letters." "Your aunt? Then where is she?" Ezekiel demanded, his voice louder than he intended. Maggie's gaze didn't waver. She looked him right in the eye. She took sick, sir. Consumption. It was fast. She took a small breath. She passed on 3 weeks ago. The words were like stones dropped into a deep well. Passed on, dead. The woman he was supposed to marry was dead. And in her place stood this child. She was all I had left, Maggie continued, her voice matter of fact, as if she were reciting a lesson. Ma and Pa died in the fever last year. Before Aunt Millicent went, she made me promise. She said your letters sounded like you were a good man, a decent man. She said you needed help, and maybe you could still use some, even if it wasn't the kind you paid for. Ezekiel looked around wildly, desperately. He looked at the conductor, Pike, who was watching them with a curious expression. He looked at the train, a great black beast ready to steal this problem away as quickly as it had arrived. Child, he said, trying to keep his voice gentle. I can't. This is no place for a little girl. This is hard country. Maggie's chin lifted. A flicker of something, defiance, maybe pride, flashed in her eyes. Begging your pardon, Mr. Thompson, but I'm not afraid of hard work. I've been looking after myself and my aunt for a long time. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I'm stronger than I look. The train whistle blew a sharp, final blast. It was leaving. Now or never. Conductor Pike walked over, tipping his hat. Everything all right here, Thompson? This little one belonging to you? Ezekiel looked down at Maggie. She was braced for it. He could see it in the set of her small shoulders, in the tight grip she had on her bag. She was expecting him to say no, to send her away, to put her back on that train to God knows where. A 10-year-old orphan, alone. What kind of man would he be? His own loneliness felt like a bitter pill in his throat. He had asked for a partner, for help, for an end to the silence. And this is what the universe or God or whatever was out there had sent him. A joke, a cruel, cosmic joke. But looking into those big, brown, surprisingly steady eyes, he couldn't do it. He heard his own voice, rough and unfamiliar. Yes, he said, she's with me. The relief that washed over Maggie's face was so profound it was like watching the sun break through clouds. She hid it quickly, schooling her features back into that stoic mask, but he had seen it. Pike nodded, satisfied. All right then. He climbed back onto the train, and with a lurch and a groan of steel, it began to pull away, leaving Ezekiel Thompson standing on the platform with a 10-year-old girl who was supposed to be his wife. The dust settled. The silence of the prairie rushed back in. I know this isn't what you planned, Mr. Thompson, Maggie said into the quiet. I won't be a burden. I'll earn my keep. I swear it. There was a terrible sadness in the way she said it, the sound of a child who had never been allowed to be one. He thought of Priscilla, of the nursery they had planned, of the children they had prayed for. A different prayer, a different answer. Call me Ezekiel, he said, his voice softer now. Or Zeke. Everyone does. He reached for her ridiculously heavy bag. Let's get you home. The ride to the ranch was long and quiet. The wagon creaked and groaned over the rutted track, a lonely sound in the vast emptiness. Ezekiel stole glances at the girl beside him. She sat straight and proper, her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape pass with a solemn intensity. You from the city? He asked, trying to break the silence. Philadelphia, she replied. My pa ran a boarding house. After he and Ma passed, I went with Aunt Millicent. She was a seamstress. And you cared for her? Yes, sir. Zeke, she corrected herself. When she got too weak, I had to. I learned to cook, to bargain at the market. I learned to manage. He was struck by that word. Manage. It was an adult word. A word for someone who carried the weight of the world. How old are you, Maggie? I'll be 11 come the fall, she said. I know I'm small, but I'm hardy. They crested a rise, and the Thompson ranch spread out below them. It wasn't much. A simple farmhouse, a barn in need of paint, a few outbuildings, and acres of land that looked tired and empty. The place looked like him. Worn down. He expected her to look disappointed, a city girl, seeing this desolate patch of dirt. But she didn't. Her eyes scanned the property, taking it all in. "It's a good place," she said finally. "It looks peaceful." "It was prosperous once," Ezekiel heard himself say. Before the hard times," she finished for him, her perception once again unnerving. "I'll help you. We can make it prosperous again." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. The silence inside was thick, dusty. He opened a few windows, letting in the hot air. Maggie stood in the middle of the living room, a small figure in a big, empty space. "It's a very fine house, Zeke," she said politely. "It's empty," he said, the truth of it hitting him harder than usual. "My wife, Priscilla, she was the one who made it a home. I haven't had the heart to change anything." He led her upstairs to the spare room. It was small, with a simple iron bed and a chest of drawers. The window looked out over the mountains. "This was going to be," he started, then stopped. He couldn't say it. "The nursery. This is your room now." She set her bag on the bed and ran a hand over the patchwork quilt. "It's the nicest room I've ever had," she whispered. He felt a pang in his chest, a mix of pity and something else, something protective. Downstairs, he gestures vaguely at the kitchen. "I'm not much of a cook," he admitted. "Mostly beans and jerky." Maggie looked at him with an expression of genuine horror. "A man can't work on beans and jerky. That's no way to live." She rolled up the sleeves of her worn dress. "If you have supplies, I'll make us a proper supper. You just sit down and rest." He was too stunned to argue. He sat at the kitchen table and watched as this 10-year-old child moved around his kitchen with a confidence that baffled him. She found the flour, the salt pork, the potatoes. Her movements were quick, efficient, sure. She didn't ask where anything was. It was like she already knew. The smell of frying pork and onions filled the house for the first time in years. It was the smell of life. As she worked, she hummed a little tune. It was a strange, sad little song, but it was sound. It was noise in the crushing silence. He found himself watching her hands. They were small, but they were not a child's hands. They were capable, moving with a purpose that made him deeply, profoundly uneasy. Who was this girl? Really? The supper she served was the best he'd eaten in 3 years. Fried potatoes, crisp and golden, salt pork cooked to perfection, and fluffy, impossible biscuits she seemed to have conjured from thin air. "This is incredible," he said, his mouth full. She beamed, and for a second, she looked like a normal child. "Aunt Millicent said good food shows you care." Later, they sat on the porch as the sky bled purple and orange. The vastness of it all seemed to settle over them. "Zeke," she said, her voice small, "thank you for not sending me away." "I couldn't do that," he said. "Most men would have," she stated, not with self-pity, but with a chilling certainty. "I know this wasn't what you wanted, but I'll work hard. I can clean, I can garden, and I'm good with numbers. I kept all my aunt's books for her business." Good with numbers. Of course she was. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely sound that usually made his own loneliness ache. Tonight, it was just a sound. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll give you a proper tour. There's a creek down past the barn. Good for swimming." "I'd like that," she said. She looked up at the stars more than she'd ever seen in the city. "It's so quiet here." Too quiet for some. She was silent for a long moment, then said something that stuck with him long after she'd gone up to her room. "I don't mind quiet," she said. "The city is loud. It's easy to hide in the noise. Out here there's nowhere to hide." He watched her go upstairs. He stayed on the porch, the unfamiliar feeling of a full stomach and a not quite empty house settling over him. He had wanted a wife, a partner, a woman to share his bed and his burdens. Instead, he got a child. A strange, solemn, impossibly capable child who cooked like a chef, spoke like an adult, and looked at the world with the eyes of someone who had already seen too much of it. He felt a cold knot of suspicion in his gut. Her story was neat, too neat. An orphan, a dying aunt, a final promise. It was the stuff of storybooks. But life wasn't a storybook. Life was brutal and messy. As he finally headed inside, he passed the kitchen. It was spotless. The dishes were washed and stacked. The floor was swept. It was cleaner than it had been since Priscilla was alive. It should have been comforting. Instead, it was terrifying. The next few days were a blur of bewilderment for Ezekiel. Maggie rose before him each morning. By the time he came downstairs, coffee was brewing and breakfast was on the stove. She wasn't just cooking. She was creating meals from his meager supplies that bordered on miraculous. She insisted on taking over the house. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, and mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She found Priscilla's old vegetable garden, a tangled mess of weeds, and attacked it with a ferocity that was both admirable and alarming. "The soil is good," she announced one afternoon, her hands and face smudged with dirt. "We just need to clear it out. Do you have any seeds left?" He found an old box of them in the barn. He'd meant to plant them last spring, but the effort had seemed too much. He gave them to her, and she organized them with the precision of a general planning a campaign. He tried to teach her things, how to identify birds, how to read the weather in the clouds. But it often felt like she was the one teaching him. She had a quiet wisdom that was unnerving. "What are we going to tell people in town?" she asked one evening, not looking up from the shirt she was darning. The question was casual, but it hung in the air between them. He'd been dreading this. "What do you think we should tell them?" "We could say I'm your niece," she said, her voice even. "Your brother's girl. He died, and my mother couldn't care for me. Something simple. Something they can't check." The practicality of it chilled him. A 10-year-old shouldn't think about stories that can't be checked. "My name could be Thompson now," she added. "Magnolia Thompson. It would make things easier." Easier. The word echoed in the quiet room. She was all about making things easier. For him. For her. For their story. The first trip to Willow Creek together felt like walking into an ambush. The town was small, tongues wagged. He knew what they would be thinking. Ezekiel Thompson, the grieving widower, suddenly showing up with a child. They hadn't even tied up the wagon before Bertha Morrison descended on them. Bertha ran the general store, and her real business was gossip. Her eyes, small and sharp like a bird's, fixed on Maggie. "Ezekiel Thompson. Well, for pity's sake, who is this?" she boomed, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "Bertha," Ezekiel said, forcing a smile. "This is my niece, Magnolia. Maggie. Her folks passed. She's come to live with me." The lie felt clumsy and heavy in his mouth. Bertha's eyes narrowed. She bent down, getting uncomfortably close to Maggie. "Oh, you poor dear. A niece, you say? Which brother would that be, Ezekiel? I don't recall you mentioning a brother with a family." Before Ezekiel could stammer out an answer, Maggie stepped forward. "My father was Elias Thompson," she said, her voice clear and polite. "He was Uncle Zeke's younger brother. He lived back east. You wouldn't have known him." Bertha straightened up, taken aback by the child's composure. "Well, I see." Inside the store, Bertha continued her interrogation under the guise of friendly chatter. "And where are you from, child?" "Philadelphia," Maggie answered smoothly. "But I like it much better here. The air is so clean." "And you're happy, living out on that big, empty ranch with just your uncle?" Bertha pressed, her gaze sharp. "Oh, yes, ma'am," Maggie said, and she managed a smile so sweet and innocent, it could have melted a glacier. "Uncle Zeke is the kindest man in the world. I feel so safe with him." Ezekiel felt a sweat break out on his neck. The girl was a performer. She was playing a part, and she was playing it perfectly. Too perfectly. He watched her, this small child, navigating the treacherous waters of small-town gossip with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. By the time they left, the story of Ezekiel's tragic orphaned niece was all over town. But Ezekiel could feel Bertha Morrison's eyes on his back. She wasn't convinced, and if Bertha wasn't convinced, no one would be. On the ride home, the silence was different. It was tense. "You did good in there," he said finally. "I told you I'd earn my keep," she replied, not looking at him. "I won't cause you any trouble." But she was already trouble. She was a walking, talking mystery that was drawing attention he didn't want. He had wanted a quiet life. He had wanted to be left alone with his grief. Instead, he was now the subject of intense speculation, all because of this strange little girl. The weeks turned into a month. The garden flourished under Maggie's care. The house was spotless. The meals were regular and delicious. The ranch was slowly starting to look like a place where people actually lived, not a place where a man was waiting to die. And Maggie, she was relentless. She worked from sunup to sundown. One evening, he found her in the barn trying to hoist a saddle onto his horse. Thunder. The saddle was nearly as big as she was. "What are you doing?" he demanded, rushing forward. "I want to learn to ride," she said, grunting with the effort. "If I can ride, I can help you with the fences. I can check on the creek. I can be more useful." Useful. Always that word. He took the saddle from her. "You're a child, Maggie. You're supposed to play, to rest." She looked at him, her face smudged with dust and sweat. "Playing doesn't put food on the table, Zeke. Playing doesn't fix a broken roof." It was the bleakest thing he had ever heard. His suspicion was now a constant low hum in the back of his mind. He started watching her. He noticed things. She never talked about her parents, not really. Only in the vague terms of their story. She never cried. She never had nightmares. She never acted like a child who had lost everyone she loved. She acted like a soldier. One night he couldn't sleep. He went downstairs for a drink of water and saw a light under the door of the small room he used as an office. He pushed the door open quietly. There she was, asleep, her head resting on his ledger book. A pencil was still clutched in her hand. He walked over, his heart pounding. He looked at the ledger. She hadn't just been looking at it. She had been working on it. She had found errors in his math. She had reorganized the columns. And at the bottom, in her neat, precise handwriting, was a series of calculations, a plan, a budget for buying new cattle, a projection of profits based on the sale of vegetables. He stared at the page, his blood running cold. This wasn't the work of a child who was good with numbers. This was the work of an accountant. He looked down at her small, sleeping form, an angel of domestic efficiency, a financial prodigy in a patched blue dress. "Who are you?" he thought, the question a silent scream in his mind. He gently picked her up. She was light as a feather. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring something. He leaned closer to hear. It wasn't Mama or Papa. It wasn't Aunt Millie. It was a name. Sarah. His breath caught in his chest. Who was Sarah? He carried her up to her room and tucked her into bed. He stood there for a long time, watching her sleep, the moonlight painting a silver stripe across her face. Magnolia. A beautiful name. A borrowed name. He went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the ledger book open in front of him. The neat columns of numbers seemed to mock him. He had taken in a stray, a helpful, hard-working stray. But he hadn't taken in an orphan. He had taken in a liar. Every perfect meal, every clean room, every mended shirt now felt like a part of the deception. He was being managed, just like her aunt's business, just like his own ranch ledger. He was a piece in her game, a pawn she was moving around a board he couldn't even see. The feeling of being cared for was replaced by a creeping dread. He wasn't her guardian. He was her mark. But what was the game? What did she want from him? His failing ranch? His meager savings? It didn't make sense. The next morning, she was the same as always, cheerful, efficient. She served him pancakes and bacon, humming her little tune. He watched her, trying to see past the performance, trying to see the girl named Sarah. "You were up late," he said, his voice casual. She didn't miss a beat. "I couldn't sleep. I was just looking at your books. I hope you don't mind. I think we can buy 5 head of cattle come spring if we're careful." She said it so easily. He felt a wave of anger, hot and sharp. He wanted to grab her by her small shoulders, shake her, and demand the truth. "Who are you? Why are you here?" But he didn't. He couldn't. Because as he looked at her, sitting across the table from him, looking so small and earnest, another thought pushed through the anger. A more terrifying thought. What if the truth was worse than the lie? What if this strange, brilliant, deceitful child was his only hope? The ranch was coming back to life. He was eating again. He was sleeping better. The crushing weight of his grief was starting to lift, replaced by this new, sharp-edged anxiety. He was trapped by her help, trapped by her lies. He spent the next weeks in a state of quiet turmoil. He was a stranger in his own home, a silent observer of his own life being expertly managed by a 10-year-old imposter. He played his part, the grateful uncle. He praised her cooking. He thanked her for her work in the garden. And all the while, he watched. And he waited. He knew something was coming. People like her, people with secrets that big, they were always running from something. Or something was coming for them. It was a hot Tuesday in late July when it happened. He was fixing a fence post at the edge of his property when he saw the rider. A man on a fine bay horse, not a rancher's nag. He wore a dark city suit, completely out of place in the Montana dust. He rode with an air of purpose, of authority. Ezekiel's gut clenched. This was it. He walked back to the farmhouse, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man was dismounting as he arrived. He was in his 40s, with a handsome, cruel face and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. Maggie was on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl. When she saw the man, the bowl slipped from her lap, scattering green peas across the wooden planks. All the color drained from her face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "Well, well," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He ignored Ezekiel completely, his eyes locked on the terrified girl. "There you are. I have to admit, you were harder to find than I expected." He took a step toward the porch. Maggie scrambled backward, pressing herself against the farmhouse wall. "Who are you?" Ezekiel demanded, his voice a low growl. He stepped between the man and Maggie. The man finally turned his cold eyes on Ezekiel. He gave a thin, unpleasant smile. "My apologies. My name is Chester Whitmore." Whitmore. The name from the letters, Maggie's name. "I am Millicent's brother," he said, "which makes me this little runaway's legal guardian. I've come to take her home." The carefully constructed world that Maggie had built, the world that Ezekiel had allowed himself to be drawn into, shattered into a million pieces. The truth was here, and it was worse than he could have ever imagined. Chester Whitmore's words hung in the hot, still air. Legal guardian. Ezekiel looked from the man's smug face to Maggie's, which was a mask of pure terror. She wasn't just scared, she was petrified. "She's not going anywhere with you," Ezekiel said, his voice dangerously quiet. He planted his feet, a human wall between them. Chester chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I think she is. The law is quite clear on the matter. She is my niece, my ward. She ran away from Philadelphia after my dear sister passed. I have the papers to prove it." He patted the breast pocket of his tailored suit coat. Birth certificates, my sister's will, my letters of guardianship, all legal, all binding. This is her home now, Ezekiel insisted, his mind racing. She's my niece. Is she now? Chester's smile widened. A convenient story, but a fiction. I am her only living blood relative. You, Mr. Thompson, are a stranger who appears to be harboring a runaway child. The sheriff will be very interested to hear about this. At the mention of the sheriff, Ezekiel felt a chill go down his spine. He thought of Bertha Morrison's suspicious eyes, of the whispers in town. A well-dressed man from the city with legal papers versus a reclusive rancher with a story that even he knew was full of holes. He knew how this would look. Maggie, Ezekiel said, not taking his eyes off Chester. Go inside the house. She didn't move. She was frozen, her eyes wide, locked on the man who called himself her uncle. Hello, Magnolia, Chester said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. Have you forgotten your Uncle Chester? We have so much to discuss, specifically the matter of your inheritance. Inheritance. The word landed like a bomb. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The lies, the incredible competence, the desperate need to make herself useful. She wasn't just running away. She was running with something, money. You're not taking her, Ezekiel said again, but the conviction in his voice was starting to fray. This man had the law on his side. Don't be a fool, rancher, Chester sneered. I admire her initiative, I truly do. Finding some backwoods fool to take her in while she waits to come of age. It was a clever plan. But the game is up. Magnolia, come here, now. He took a step forward, and Ezekiel moved with him, blocking his path. For a tense moment, the two men stood face to face, the air crackling with unspoken violence. I'll be back, Chester said, his voice a low threat. And I'll have Sheriff Morrison with me. You can explain to him why you have my ward. You can explain to a judge. But I assure you, by this time tomorrow, she will be on a train back to Philadelphia with me, where she belongs. He turned on his heel, mounted his fine horse, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust hanging in the air. The moment he was gone, Maggie collapsed. Her legs just gave out, and she sank to the porch floor, her body racked with silent, terrified sobs. Ezekiel knelt beside her, his own anger and confusion a roaring fire in his chest. Maggie! Maggie, look at me! She looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. He's not what he says, she whispered, her voice ragged. He's your uncle? She nodded, a jerky, frightened movement. Yes, but he's evil, Zeke. Aunt Millicent, she was terrified of him. She said he was a gambler, that he'd lost all his own money. She said he was after mine. Your inheritance? From my parents, she choked out. They owned the boarding house. They had savings. It's not a fortune, but it's enough. It's in a trust until I'm 18. He's been trying to get control of it ever since they died. That's why Aunt Millicent sent me here. To hide me from him. The pieces were falling into place, but they were forming a picture more terrible than he had imagined. This wasn't just a runaway. This was a rescue mission, and he was the unwitting accomplice. She knew he would find her in Philadelphia, Maggie continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. She used the last of her money to buy my ticket. She said you sounded kind in your letters, that you lived so far away, he would never think to look here. But he had. He had found her. We have to fight him, Zeke, she pleaded, grabbing his arm, her small fingers digging into his skin. You can't let him take me. He'll take the money and then, he said he'd marry me off to one of his creditors, to pay his debts. The thought of it, of this child being sold like cattle, made Ezekiel feel sick. He looked down at her, at this strange, lying, brilliant, terrified girl. The suspicion he'd harbored for weeks curdled into a fierce, white-hot protectiveness. He didn't care about the lies anymore. He didn't care who she was or what she'd done. He only cared about the monster who wanted to take her away. But what could he do? Chester was right. The law was the law. Blood was thicker than water. "He has papers, Maggie," he said gently. "He's your legal kin." "But you're my family!" she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "He's not. Blood doesn't make you family. Caring for someone does." Her words hit him like a physical blow. Caring for someone. He had cared for her, more than he wanted to admit. Her presence had filled the crushing silence of his life. Her strange, solemn ways had become the new rhythm of his days. He had been so focused on her deception that he hadn't realized the truth. He needed her, as much as she needed him. "All right," he said, his voice firm. He made a decision. In that moment, on that dusty porch, he chose his side. "All right, he's not taking you. I don't know how, but we're going to stop him." A flicker of hope returned to her eyes. "Really?" "Really," he promised. "Now get inside and wash your face. We need to think. We need a plan." As she disappeared into the house, Ezekiel stood and looked out at the road where Chester Whitmore had vanished. The fight was coming. A fight he was not equipped for. A fight against the law, against a rich, powerful man from the city. He was just a broken rancher. What chance did he have? He went into his office and looked at the ledger, at her neat columns, at her careful plan to save his ranch. She had been planning for their future. "Our future," she had said. He thought about the name she had whispered in her sleep. Sarah. He was protecting a girl named Magnolia Whitmore, heir to a small fortune. But who was he really protecting? The lie was deeper than he knew. He could feel it. And he had a sickening feeling that Chester Whitmore wasn't the only one with a secret. The storm had arrived, and they were right in the middle of it. Chester Whitmore was true to his word. The next afternoon, he returned with Sheriff Morrison in tow. The sheriff was a decent man, but he was a man of the law, and his face was grim as he dismounted. "Ezekiel," he said, his voice heavy. "Mr. Whitmore here has made some serious claims. He has documents that appear to give him legal guardianship of the girl you're calling your niece." Ezekiel stood on the porch, Maggie behind him, her small hand clutching the back of his shirt. "His claim is a lie, Sheriff. He's after her money, not her welfare." "That may be," the sheriff said, not unkindly, "but my job is to uphold the law, not to judge a man's character. His papers look to be in order. He's the girl's blood uncle." Chester smirked from beside the sheriff. "The child is a runaway. She's clearly impressionable. This man has filled her head with lies about me. I simply want to take my niece home, where she can be properly cared for." "This is her home," Maggie cried out from behind Ezekiel. "He's the liar!" The sheriff sighed, pushing his hat back on his head. "Look, Zeke, I don't want to do this, but my hands are tied. The law says she goes with him." "No," Ezekiel said, his voice like stone. "If he wants her, he'll have to go through a judge. We'll have a hearing, a proper one." Chester laughed. "A hearing? On what grounds? You have no legal claim to her, Thompson. You're nobody." "I'm the man who took her in when she had nowhere else to go," Ezekiel shot back. "I'm the one who fed her and clothed her. I'm the one who's cared for her. That has to count for something." The sheriff looked from Ezekiel's determined face to Chester's smug one. He looked at the terrified child hiding behind Ezekiel's legs. He was a father himself. "All right, Ezekiel," the sheriff said, making a decision. "I won't remove the child by force today, but I'm scheduling a hearing with Judge Whitfield for next week. You can make your case then. But I'm warning you, if you can't provide a legal basis for keeping her, she's going with him, and that's final." Chester looked furious, but he held his tongue. He knew he would win in court. It was just a matter of time. He gave Ezekiel a look of pure hatred, mounted his horse, and rode off with the sheriff. The moment they were gone, The fight began. Ezekiel rode into town and used nearly all the money they had saved, the money from Maggie's vegetable sales, to hire a lawyer, a young, eager man named Mr. Davies. "The odds are not in our favor, Mr. Thompson," Davies said, looking over the case. "Nepotism is a powerful legal standing. We need to prove that Mr. Whitmore is an unfit guardian, and we need to prove that you are a fit one." The whole town of Willow Creek was buzzing. Bertha Morrison was having a field day, spreading stories about the strange rancher and the mysterious child and the rich gentleman from the city who had come to rescue her. The tide of public opinion was turning against them. They were seen as frauds, as liars. "We need witnesses," Davies said. "People who can testify that Maggie is happy here, that she is well cared for." But who would speak for them? Their only regular contact was with Reverend Hutchkins, who had been lending Maggie books. Ezekiel went to see him. "The child is remarkably bright," the Reverend said, stroking his beard, "and she seems content. But Ezekiel, the man is her bloodkin. Are you sure you're doing the right thing by fighting this?" "I'm sure," Ezekiel said, his jaw tight. The days leading up to the hearing were a nightmare. Chester stayed at the town's only hotel, poisoning the well, turning people against Ezekiel with whispers and lies. Ezekiel and Maggie felt like prisoners on their own ranch. The work didn't get done. The garden was neglected. They ate simple meals in silence, the unspoken tension a third person at the table. One night, Maggie came to him, her face pale. "What if we lose, Zeke?" "We won't lose," he said, with more confidence than he felt. "But what if we do? You've spent all our money on the lawyer. The ranch." "The ranch doesn't matter," he said, his voice fierce. "You matter. We're a family, Maggie, and family fights for each other." She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've caused you so much trouble." "You've brought this house back to life," he told her. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Don't you ever forget that." He was telling the truth. Sometime during the chaos and the fear, he had stopped seeing her as a mystery or a liar. He just saw her as his daughter, the daughter he and Priscilla had always wanted. The day of the hearing arrived. The small church that served as a courtroom was packed. The entire town was there to see the spectacle. Chester sat with his lawyer, looking confident and smug. Ezekiel sat with Maggie and Mr. Davies, his stomach in a cold, tight knot. Judge Whitfield, a stern man with a fair reputation, called the court to order. Chester's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of a loving uncle, desperately searching for his orphaned niece, only to find her in the clutches of a strange recluse. He produced the documents, the birth certificate for Magnolia Grace Whitmore, Millicent's will naming Chester as guardian, a stack of official-looking papers that seemed to seal their fate. Then it was their turn. Mr. Davies called Reverend Hutchkins, who spoke hesitantly about Maggie's intelligence. He called the blacksmith, who had seen them in town, and said the girl seemed happy enough. It was weak. It was nothing against the weight of Chester's legal documents. Ezekiel could feel it slipping away. He could see the pity in the judge's eyes. "Does the defense have anything further?" Judge Whitfield asked, his voice full of impending finality. "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Davies said. "I call Magnolia Thompson to the stand." A gasp went through the courtroom. Maggie squeezed Ezekiel's hand, then stood up and walked to the stand, her back straight, her face a pale, determined mask. Davies was gentle with her. "Maggie, can you tell the court why you don't want to live with your uncle?" "Because he is a bad man," she said, her clear voice ringing through the silent room. "He doesn't want me. He wants my parents' money. My Aunt Millicent told me to run from him. She told me to hide." Chester's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! Hearsay! The ramblings of a child." "Sustained," the judge said. "The girl's testimony is emotional, but it is not evidence." It was over. Ezekiel knew it. He reached out to put a comforting hand on Maggie's shoulder as she returned to her seat, but she shrugged it off. She was looking at Chester, a strange, new expression on her face. It wasn't fear. It was something else. It was defiance. Chester saw it too, and he decided to crush it once and for all. "Your Honor," Chester said, standing up, "I have one final piece of evidence. Evidence that will prove beyond any doubt the deceptive nature of this child and the man who is hiding her. Evidence that will end this farce immediately." He walked to his table and picked up a small leather-bound frame. He held it up for the judge to see. "This," he announced, his voice booming with triumph, "is a photograph of my niece, the real Magnolia Whitmore, taken just a year ago." He turned the frame around. The courtroom gasped as one. Ezekiel's heart stopped. The girl in the photograph was not Maggie. She had the same honey-colored hair, but her face was different. Softer. Prettier. It was a different girl entirely. Ezekiel stared at the picture, then at the girl beside him. The girl he had called Maggie. The girl he had called his daughter. She wasn't Magnolia Whitmore. She was a ghost, an imposter. His entire world, everything he thought he knew, everything he had fought for, turned to ash in his mouth. He had been played. He was the biggest fool in Montana. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence filled the courtroom. Every eye was on the girl in the witness box. The girl who wasn't Magnolia Whitmore. She sat frozen, her face as white as bone, her mask of composure finally shattered. Chester Whitmore stood like a triumphant showman, the photograph held high. "As you can see, Your Honor, this child is a fraud, a grifter. She has stolen my niece's name, my niece's story. God only knows where the real Magnolia is. This imposter likely did something to her to get her ticket west." The implication was horrifying. The whispers in the room turned from gossip to accusation. Murderer. Thief. Judge Whitfield stared at the girl, his face a thundercloud. "Young lady," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you will explain yourself. Now, what is your real name?" The girl didn't speak. She just stared at Ezekiel, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror he had never seen before. It was the look of an animal caught in a trap. "Her name is Sarah," Ezekiel said, his voice rough. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The girl, Sarah, flinched as if he had struck her. She had told him that name in her sleep. He had held on to it, a secret weapon, a final piece of the puzzle. He had never imagined he would use it like this. "Sarah?" the judge demanded. "Sarah who?" Sarah finally broke. A single tear tracked a path through the dust on her cheek. Then another. She took a ragged breath. "My name is Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just Sarah. I don't have another name." Her story came out in broken pieces, a confession torn from the depths of her soul. She wasn't an orphan in the way she had claimed. She was a foundling, left at an orphanage in Philadelphia as a baby. An orphanage that was less a sanctuary and more a prison, run by a cruel master who worked the children like slaves. She told them about the real Magnolia Whitmore. Magnolia had been sent to the orphanage after her parents died, while legal matters were sorted out. She was frail, sickly. Sarah had been assigned to look after her. They had become friends. Millicent, her aunt, was sick, Sarah explained, her voice gaining a little strength. She couldn't take Magnolia right away, but she wrote to her. She told her about the plan, about the mail-order bride ad, about a kind man named Ezekiel Thompson in a place called Montana, a place where she could be safe. Then, tragedy struck twice. Millicent died of her consumption in the city, and at the orphanage, a fever swept through. The real Magnolia, already weak, was one of the first to die. "She died in my arms," Sarah whispered, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Before she did, she gave me her things, her letters from her aunt, and the train ticket. She said, She said I should go, that I should be Magnolia, that I should find the kind man and have the life she was supposed to have. She looked directly at Ezekiel, her eyes swimming with tears. I didn't hurt her. I loved her. She was my only friend. I took her name because I wanted to be someone. I didn't want to be just Sarah from the orphanage anymore. I wanted a family. I wanted to be wanted. The raw honesty of her confession hung in the air. It was a story of desperation, not deception, of survival, not greed. Ezekiel looked at Chester Whitmore. The man's face was a mask of fury. This complicated things for him. His claim was to Magnolia Whitmore and her inheritance. This girl had no inheritance. She was worthless to him, but his pride was at stake. "She's a liar and a thief," Chester roared. "She should be sent back to that orphanage or to a reform school. She's a delinquent." "She's a child who did what she had to do to survive," a new voice said. Ezekiel turned. It was his lawyer, Mr. Davies, standing tall. "This girl, Sarah, has proven herself to be hardworking, intelligent, and kind. She has built a home here. Mr. Whitmore has proven only that he is greedy and cruel. His entire claim is based on a girl who is, tragically, deceased. He has no legal standing here. He has no claim on Sarah." The judge looked at Sarah, then at Chester, then at Ezekiel. He was in a difficult position. The law was a tangled mess. Ezekiel felt a strange calm settle over him. The anger, the sense of betrayal, it was all gone. It had been burned away by the raw, painful truth of her story. He didn't see an imposter anymore. He saw a terrified, brave little girl who had fought her way across a continent for the chance at a life. He knew what he had to do. He stood up. "Your Honor." All eyes turned to him. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice clear and strong, ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "It doesn't matter what her name is. It doesn't matter where she came from. For the past 3 months, she has been my family. She has cared for me, and I have cared for her." He walked over to the witness box and stood beside Sarah, putting a hand on her trembling shoulder. "Chester Whitmore is right about one thing," he said, looking directly at the judge. "I am not her uncle. I have no blood claim to her." He paused, letting the words sink in. He took a deep breath. "I am her father, and I am here today to ask this court to make it legal. I want to adopt her. I want to give her my name. The name she chose for herself when she stood up to Bertha Morrison in the general store. The Thompson name." A collective gasp went through the room. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning hope. Chester's face went purple with rage. "This is an outrage, an absurdity," he sputtered. "Is it?" Judge Whitfield asked, a glint of something new in his eye. He looked at Ezekiel. "You would do that? For this child? A child who lied to you?" "The lie is not who she is," Ezekiel said firmly. "Her heart is who she is. Her courage is who she is, and she has the heart and courage of a Thompson. She is my daughter." Sarah let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and threw her arms around Ezekiel's waist, burying her face in his shirt. The judge looked at the scene before him, the tall, weathered rancher, standing protective over the small, weeping girl. He looked at the furious, defeated face of Chester Whitmore. He picked up his gavel. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said, his voice like iron, "your petition of guardianship over the deceased Magnolia Whitmore is dismissed. You have no further business with this court, or with this child. I suggest you take the next train back to Philadelphia." Chester stared, speechless, as the judge brought the gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering. The tide of public opinion had turned in an instant. They weren't cheering for a legal victory. They were cheering for a father and a daughter. Ezekiel held Sarah tight, his own eyes burning. He had come to the train station looking for a wife to save his ranch. He had found something infinitely more precious. He had found a reason to live again. He had found his family. As the crowd surged around them, offering congratulations, slapping him on the back, Ezekiel looked down at the top of Sarah's head. She was still clinging to him as if she'd never let go. "It's okay," he whispered into her hair. "You're home. You're finally home, Sarah Thompson." She looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and joy. "I like that name," she whispered back. The Thompson Ranch, once a place of silence and grief, became a place of life. Sarah, or Maggie, as most folks in town continued to call her, truly blossomed. Freed from her secrets, she finally learned how to be a child. Ezekiel taught her to ride a horse not because it was useful, but because it was fun. They had picnics by the creek. He read to her from the Reverend's books by the fire at night, not stories of hardship, but tales of adventure and magic. The ranch prospered. With Sarah's keen mind for numbers and Ezekiel's renewed strength and purpose, they bought more cattle. They expanded the garden. The Thompson Ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. Chester Whitmore was never seen in Willow Creek again. The inheritance of the real Magnolia Whitmore remained in a Philadelphia bank, untouched, a sad memorial to a life cut short. But Sarah, in her own way, honored her friend's memory every day by living the life Magnolia had dreamed of, a life of freedom, safety, and love. Years passed. The silver at Ezekiel's temples spread, and Sarah grew from a scrawny, determined girl into a strong, confident young woman. She had his quiet strength and her own fierce intelligence. She eventually took over the ranch's books completely, her skill becoming something of a local legend. When she was 20, she married the blacksmith's son, a good, steady man who loved her for the incredible woman she was. They built a new house on Thompson land, not far from the old homestead. One evening, years later, Ezekiel sat on his porch, watching his grandchildren play in the yard. They were chasing fireflies, their laughter echoing in the twilight. Sarah came and sat beside him, handing him a cup of coffee. "What are you thinking about, Pa?" she asked, using the name that had been his most treasured possession for years. He smiled, watching a small girl with honey-colored hair trip and fall, only to be picked up by her older brother. "I was just thinking about a train," he said, "and a very brave, very bossy little girl who stepped off it." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it? That she wasn't who you were expecting?" Ezekiel looked out at the land, at the family, at the life that had been built from a lie born of desperation. He thought of the lonely man he had been, a ghost haunting his own life. He was no longer that man. "Never," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the luckiest day of my life. God sent me exactly what I needed, not what I thought I wanted. He had asked for a wife to help him. He was given a daughter to save him. Sometimes, the greatest blessings in our lives arrive in the most unexpected packages. They challenge us, they change us, and they force us to look beyond our own plans to see the bigger, more beautiful picture being painted for us. A family isn't always about the blood you share. It's about the love you give, the fights you win together, and the home you build in each other's hearts. If you were moved by the story of Ezekiel and Sarah, and you believe in the power of second chances and chosen family, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It helps us bring you more stories like this one, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Ezekiel's shoes?